another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're coming back at you with more VMware. That's right, more of the VMware Certified Professional version 6, part 2 on creating virtual machines. Joining me in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into creating our virtual machines. And technically, in the last episode, we created virtual machines, so you could say we're done, but there were a lot of options that we didn't get to. I know I left off talking about hardware revision, so we want to take a look at that and a few other things. And Wes, I'm looking at the notes that I put together, and there's probably going to be a part 3 on this thing, because I really do have a lot of little nuts and bolts, little details that I want to tackle on these that are important to understand. When you create a virtual machine, there's a lot of choices. And so what we saw in part 1, that was like the bare minimum. That's what it takes to get a virtual machine up and running, and that's it. Now, we need to go into the more advanced things, right? What do we tweak about the virtual machine to really get it working? Now, one of the last things I talked about were the hardware versions. Every virtual machine is built on a framework, and that framework it's a set of, I don't want to say virtual hardware, it's not all virtual hardware, some of it's actual hardware, but it's a set of rules that virtual machine can use to talk to the hardware on the ESXi hypervisor. And most of the hardware is direct access. Some of it, though, is para-virtualized access or access through some kind of virtualized hardware. And the virtual machine has to know what to look for. It has to have certain drivers, has to have certain hardware identifiers that it touches. And from time to time, VMware updates those. And when they do, they create another hardware version. And so I talked about how in ESXi 6, we're now up to hardware version 11. But in VMware Fusion, for example, they're up to hardware version 12. So they roll out these new hardware versions, they test things out, and only when they're nice and stable do they move them over into ESX. Now, we don't necessarily even really care about that. Sometimes there's a feature we need or that we want, right? So ESXi 5.5 shipped with hardware version 10 is the default. ESXi 6 wants to go to hardware version 11. The biggest difference between 10 and 11 is that in hardware version 10, a virtual machine can only have up to 1 terabyte of RAM. I know, just 1 terabyte of RAM. But when you go to hardware version 11, you can have up to 4 terabytes of RAM. So it basically increased the amount of memory that we can handle. Now, how many of us are running 1 terabyte of memory in our virtual machines? Not me. I don't have a single virtual machine anywhere that has even 500 gigs of RAM, right? But there are people out there who need it, and if you need it, you've got to get to that newer hardware version. So most of us don't really care what the hardware version is, because even hardware version 6 probably has all the different features that we need for a typical virtual machine. But there may come a time when you need to upgrade, when you need to say, all right, I'm on hardware version 10, and I need to bump up to 11. Well, in the show last time, we created a SQL server, a database server, and I made it hardware version 10 on purpose. So we're going to see upgrading that one to 11 and getting that in place. And I know I'm kind of playing it up as a big deal. It's actually not very spectacular at all. We're going to tell it to upgrade, and it just kind of does it. The virtual machine usually has to reboot, and then that's it. So it's not really spectacular and amazing.
Well, if we don't get the ooh-ah effect, right, like watching fireworks, well, how is it that we can even tell that the upgrade is done, completed, successful? What is it that we can see?
There's a couple of ways, right? So one we can see it in the settings of the virtual machine, right? So if I come in and I go into my host and clusters and I find that SQL server or a database, so I call it DB01, right? So I can find DB01 over here, and when you go to manage it and you take a look at its settings and information, you can actually see it right here under compatibility. See how mine says ESXi 5.5 and later, VM version 10. Okay, so I know that I'm at hardware version 10 on this virtual machine. If I take a look at my web server over here and I look at the same data, I'm at VM version 11, ESXi 6.0 and later. All right, so when I do the upgrade, at a minimum, I'll see this text change right here. Again, not amazing. But we can also see it in the files for the virtual machine, and now that I think about it, we never really looked at those files, did we? When you create a virtual machine, it asks you what data store to place it in, right? So like when I created this virtual machine, this Web01, it asked for a data store for it to go in, and it put it there, right? If I edit my settings and take a look at it, I should be able to turn it up in here somewhere. The data store is buried in here. Well, shoot. Somewhere in here. It tells me the data store that we put it in, and it is, well, I know what data store it's in. We can go to related objects and we'll see it there. So it's going to be punched into a data store, and here we go. You see I'm tied to 2 data stores, the ISO data store where I'm actually getting my CD image for the install, and the shared data store, which is where I put my virtual machine files. And if you browse to that data store, inside of the data store you can go to Manage and Files, and you can see what's in the data store. And so I'm looking at that shared data store, and I see a couple of folders, Web01, Web02, DB01. All right, well, actually, I have Web01, I have DB01, I don't have a Web02. That one got left behind. Sometimes files get left behind in the data store, and that's one reason why you might need to come in here and clean it up a bit, right? I don't have a Web02 anymore, so I should probably get rid of that, and I don't need it. But actually, let's use Web02 as an example real quick. When I look at Web02, there's just a couple of files that are in it, right? I see web02.vmx, web02.vmdk, and web02.vmsd, right? So just a handful of files. These files are what actually makes up that virtual machine. And I never really use this virtual machine, so there's not much here. If I take a look at Web01, I see a lot more files in it, okay? And I may even see more files than this, depending on what I've done with that machine and how I've used it. So you may see tons of files in here, but the 2 most important ones are the VMX files and the VMDK files. Those are the 2 most important ones. That's because they actually hold the information about your virtual machine. The VMX file, that is the virtual machine configuration. So when we ran through that create a virtual machine wizard and we told it, oh, I want 500 megs of memory or 10 gigs of memory or however much, I want these CPUs, I want to add these virtual disks, I want the network to be plugged into this port group. When we made all those choices, that was all being stored right here in the VMX file. And then when we created that virtual hard drive to install our operating system on, that's the VMDK. That's a virtual machine disk, right? So that's the virtual machine hard drive. And I gave this one an 8 gig disk, and I can see this is an 8 gig file. I didn't thin provision it, I thick provisioned it. So I told it to make it an 8 gig drive, it laid out an 8 gig drive, and it did it. On the database server, I did something bigger, right? We had more than one disk. And so when I look here, I've got dbo1.vmdk, that's 8 gigs. And then I've got dbo1_1.vmdk. That's the second drive that's 100 gigs. Right? I made a bigger drive for that second drive. So I can see those files right there. Now, notice how dbo1 has 4 files in it and web01 has like 10. Well, that's because web01 is powered on. When you power on the virtual machine, more files get created. When you power it on, it reads this VMX file, and then it reads the hard drive and starts to boot the operating system, and it starts to create more. So what are these other files? Well, some are important, some aren't. Some just are transient files that come and go. So for example, this lock file. The lock file tells the system that you cannot edit the virtual machine configuration right now. The machine's powered on. If the VM is powered on, you can't edit the config. If the machine's powered off, you can, right? So if I take web01, and I'm going to go back to my virtual machines here, and take web01 and go to manage and settings and try and make changes in here, well, this machine is powered on right now. So if I try to make changes, it's not going to work. And see how CPU is grayed out, memory is grayed out, I can't change those? It won't let me do them on the fly. Can you add CPUs or take away CPUs from a machine while it's powered on? Not most of them, right? So a lot of options will be grayed out. But if I take dbo1, dbo1 is powered off. And so if I take it and I go to edit its settings, I can adjust the CPU. I can adjust the memory because it's not powered on. So that's what that lock file does. It just shows that the machine is powered on. Then, if we look at some of the other files that are created in there, if I get to the right folder again, you'll see things like NVRAM. All right, what is NVRAM? Well, it's non-volatile RAM. In a normal computer, you have BIOS, or UEFI BIOS, right? And all the settings for the hardware are stored there. The settings like, when you boot up, what's your first boot device? Do you boot to the CD drive first, or do you boot to the hard drive first? When you boot up, how much memory do you have, right? That kind of stuff is stored in the BIOS of your computer. And this is the virtual BIOS right here, the NVRAM. That's where those settings are stored. So it's pretty important.
Don, with that VMX file there, is there any way, I guess this would be a couple of questions all in one, can we directly edit those files? And if we can, should we be editing those files?
You can. You certainly can. They're just text files. The VMX files are just text, and it's got the hardware settings for that virtual machine in there. This machine's on right now. So if I were to edit it, that would probably be bad So you don't generally want to do it while the machine is powered on, but if you shut the machine down, you can edit that VMX file. You want it to be shut down anyway because the VMX file is only read when you boot up, right? So if I were to edit it while it's on, it's just going to ignore those settings, and when it shuts down, it'll probably undo them and I'll lose my changes.
We've also seen where you've dropped back to the command line many times because the GUI might be limited in what you can do. So is there a situation where you might want to modify those VMX files versus what's in the graphical user interface?
Yeah, there are. Let me see if I can get one of those VMX files open for us here real quick. I'll pull up like DB01s, and let me just get that into like a text editor. I'm sure I've got something that can open that up nice and easy. We're just good old Sublime Text. So it really is just a text file, and it is it's actually XML. So it's written in a format that almost looks easy to read. And oh, you know, I said it's XML. It's not. It's just a straight up key value. So you got a key on the left equals and a value on the right. So it's not structured XML. I'm thinking of something different apparently. But the way it works when you crack it open is you'll have a setting here on the left, and then it's defined to a value on the right. So for example, the NVRAM for this virtual machine is stored in a file called dbo1.nvram. So when it reads the VMX file and it says, hey, I need to read the BIOS settings for it, here's the file I need to go and get that, right? So sometimes it's like that. Now, this setting is not in the GUI. In the GUI, I can't change the name of where the NVRAM is stored, but I could change it here. Now, I can't think of a real world example where I'd want to do that, but it's possible.
You mentioned upgrading the version. I'm going to take a stab at this one at line 3 there. Does that tell you what the current version is of the hardware?
That is exactly it. Now, so it does say virtual HW version equals 10. So we are on version 10 versus version 11. So here's another place where I could verify that we had actually upgraded if we upgraded. Now there is more to it though, because if you scroll down, you'll start to see where it defines a lot of things, these virtual devices. And the virtual devices in version 10 are defined a little different than in version 11. And so that can make a difference down here too. There might be other changes. For example, we might have SATA controllers that were only supported starting with, I think it was version 9. And if you had earlier than version 9, you wouldn't be able to have SATA settings. You'd have to have SCSI. So if you upgraded from 9 to 10, it might add SATA configurations in here you didn't have already. I'm trying to think of an example of something that I've messed with in here. There's an option that doesn't show up. So like these Ethernet devices, see how it says Ethernet 0, and then it gives it a network name and all that stuff. The adapter that it emulates is basically creating one that uses a particular driver. And I have had times where I had software that didn't recognize that. And so I ended up coming in here and adding an extra line. There's a secret option you can put in that says emulate an Intel E1000 or one of those old, what are they, Net 1000 adapters that Novell loves so much. And you can put one of those in there. You don't normally want to do that because you get worse performance. You get better performance using the native drives that it uses in VMware. But those are options that you might have to come in here and manually change because they don't give you a GUI option to do it. But if you continue looking down here, you'll just see everything defined, like how the CD's mapped. Here's the virtual disk. This is the second virtual disk. The first one will be in here somewhere. So it's telling me where to go to find that. These are all things that are stored inside of it. And you can see when I set this up, here's the guest OS that I picked. I told it I was going to be running 64-bit CentOS, and that's how it was set up. That's something that I can't change in the GUI either. It's easier to just make a new virtual machine. So that's what these VMX files are, and they are pretty important because they are defining exactly how that virtual machine works. All right. Some of the other ones, like the VMSD, is our snapshot database. If I've taken snapshots of my virtual machine, and we haven't really talked about snapshots yet, we'll talk about them when we get to backups and restore, but a snapshot will start to create multiple virtual hard drives, and this database keeps track of them. I don't have any right now, so I've got a 0K file, right? It's basically an empty file. Whoops. And then we've got our log file, which is all the events that have occurred around this virtual machine, all stored right in here.
Don, when you start to take additional snapshots, will you see not only that database, will you see additional files as you take different snapshots, or is that information just stored in that database file?
Oh, no, it's all separate files here. You'll end up with multiple hard drive files, right? So like I've got web01.vmdk. There'll be a snapshot file for that hard drive that gets created. Same thing with the second, I've only got one hard drive on this server. So if I had any other drives, they would get it too. As well as if the snapshot was taken while the machine was on, there'd be a copy of what was in RAM stored to a file too. If the snapshot was taken while it was off, there's nothing in RAM, so that doesn't happen. But that's basically the process of what would occur. I guess I could take a snapshot real quick just to do it. I should be set up for that. Actually, I was looking at Web01, so let me do Web01. So I'm going to take a quick snapshot of it, and we'll cover snapshots again later on in the series, but I'm just going to take one. And I'm snapshotting Web01, which is powered on. And so I've got this option down here, snapshot the virtual machine's memory, and that's normally what you want. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so now it's going to grab a snapshot real quick. It shouldn't take very long. That machine's only got 500 megs of memory. The more memory you have, the longer it takes to make a snapshot. So that should almost be done. And when it's done, we'll see those extra snapshot files get created. There we go. So now if I jump back over to my data store and take a look at my files, which I'll probably need to refresh. So we'll do that real quick. And there we go. And what we should see, if this ever refreshes for me, it's not refreshing, great. If I can get my screen to refresh, then what we'll see is these new files appearing. Actually, I can probably just browse to it on the hard drive or something instead. But we'll start to see those snapshots appear inside of there. And so those files will end up like, it's so much easier to see this in the web UI if the screen updates, but there we go. Okay, so see how I've got web01.vm, I'm cursed, web01.vmdk, right? There's the hard drive. But now I've also got web01-snapshot1 vmsn and vmem, right? So there's the memory, what was in RAM captured to disk. And up here, I've got web01-000001.vmdk, a new virtual disk, and a Delta virtual disk, okay? That's the snapshot files that it created around that disk. So we start to see a lot more stuff appear based on what's going on with that machine and what it's being used for. So those are all now appearing because of that snapshot. And if we take a look at the file sizes of some of these things, my snapshot database that was 0K a few minutes ago is now 392 bytes. Now it's got data in it. The snapshot database is populated. And when I look at things like that memory file, I have 500 megs of memory on this server, and that memory file is 536 megs. That's the snapshot of everything that was in RAM at the time that snapshot was taken, and kind of plopped on top there. So that's the way that those snapshots work. And again, we'll see them later, but those are just additional files that you'll see when messing with a virtual machine. And you don't normally want to mess with those. You just want to leave them be, don't tinker with them. You might edit the VMX file from time to time, but otherwise I usually just come here to check on the sizes. If you thin provision a disk, this is a quick, easy way to come and see how big that disk has grown to over time. All right, now the whole point of this, is I realize we're over halfway through the show now, is that I wanted to upgrade the stinking hardware level of this virtual machine, and I just still haven't done it. So let's do that. So DB01, this virtual machine right here, is at hardware level 10, right? So I can see VM version 10. I want to bump it up to hardware version 11. So I'm just going to right-click on that virtual machine. And in the options, we kind of scan down the list here, we'll find where we can go and we can upgrade that virtual machine to move it up to the next version. So if I come down here to compatibility, and look, I've got upgrade VM compatibility. You've also got schedule VM compatibility upgrade. Now, why would I want to do that? It's going to reboot my virtual machine. I mean, I want it to reboot right now, so I could schedule it to occur in the middle of the night. Now, there's problems that can happen with an upgrade like this, and I probably want to be aware of it, so I don't usually like to schedule it if I can avoid it. I like to be involved, but if you're doing tons of machines, you can test it out on one, make sure it works, and then schedule it on all the other ones and roll it all out without you having to be there. I'm here though, so we'll just do upgrade compatibility, and it's warning me that I'm about to make a change that might make this virtual machine not compatible with certain hosts. If I have a cluster that has some ESXi 6 boxes and some ESX 5 boxes, and I go to hardware version 11, this guest will only be able to run on the 6 boxes. It won't be able to run on the 5 boxes anymore. I'm okay with that. Now we can pick the hardware version. Now you can only pick newer hardware versions, so I don't see the old ones, and I'm already at version 11. The only newer one, version 10, the only newer one is 11, so that's all that I get. I'll choose that, and I'll say OK. And that is how it goes. And you'll see it's already done. It already finished. And in some cases where there's a significant hardware change, it'll have to reboot the virtual machine. This was a minor change. And since it was minor, it didn't even reboot. All right. But there are some changes that won't take effect until a reboot happens. So for example, I can't add 4 terabytes of memory to this right now. I'm still held to 1 terabyte until I reboot it, because then it's going to reload that VMX file. But the VMX file is going to get updated. It should already be updated. And let's see here if I can reopen this file Actually here, let me just browse back to it. And, I can configure virtual machines like crazy, but then when it comes to just browsing my own hard drive, this is the file I want. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Great. This is going to be my complex task of the day, is just editing a file. So we'll just open it in text edit here. So now when I go and open it, I can see right there at the top of that file, virtual hardware version equals 11, right? So it's been bumped up to that new hardware version, and we can see that in the UI too. When I look at DB01, it now shows that new hardware version. So not spectacular, but that gets it upgraded.
In these upgrades, Don, where you might have some older hosts, would that potentially affect something like vMotion if you've got that set up where you're doing a live migration, maybe between an older host or something? Would you have to worry about that, like compatibility with live migration and stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. And in theory, if you've got a cluster set up, you really do want to keep your hosts all at the same version anyway. So as long as your hosts are all the same version, you're not going to have a problem. But if you've got mixed versions of hosts, when you upgrade your guest's hardware level, you're restricting where it can migrate to. So if I've only got one ESXi 6 box, and I just bumped this VM up to hardware version 11, I just killed vMotion. I can't move to any of those other older boxes until I upgrade them too. And that's why VMware always says this. When you do upgrades, you always want to upgrade. You upgrade vCenter first. That's the first thing you upgrade. Then you upgrade all of your ESXi boxes. You get them upgraded. And then this is kind of the last step, upgrading the hardware of our virtual machines. And in fact, we might even skip it. Because if there's not a new feature introduced with the hardware version that we need, then there is absolutely no benefit to go to it. It's not like it's a security fix. They're not patching security holes here. They're not improving performance. They're expanding functionality. And if you don't need that expanded functionality, don't upgrade the hardware version. You don't need to. It's easy to upgrade. You just saw that. It's impossible to downgrade. So if I want to downgrade, I either have to have a snapshot, because a snapshot will actually store the old hardware version. So I can roll back to that snapshot I made, and now I'm back to the old hardware version. Or I need to have a backup of the virtual machine. If I don't have those, there's no real way that I can downgrade that hardware version without breaking things. All right, so boy, I spent way longer on that than I intended to. So let's. It's good information to have, though. Definitely something to know. The other thing that we really didn't touch on in the last episode was when we created a virtual machine. One of the first steps that I perform on a new virtual machine. So you install the OS, you get it up and going. One of the first things that I like to do after that is to install the VM tools. All right, the VM tools are the VMware virtual machine tools, and what they are a collection of drivers. Drivers and utilities that allow the guest operating system to participate more friendly with ESX. All right, a lot of times your guests don't know they're virtualized. They think they're running on real hardware. They have no idea that they're running on top of a virtualization platform. And if we let them know, then they can actually behave a little differently and a little more nice, right? Because what is a virtual or a physical machine? If I install an OS directly on hardware, what does it assume? It assumes that it has exclusive access to the hardware and it can do whatever it wants. If it wants to lock the sound card only for its use, it can do that because it's the only one that can access that sound card. But in a virtual environment, you're not allowed to do that. You can't lock the sound card just for your use because you're sharing it across these other virtual machines too. So we need to know to play nice. And the virtual machine tools help to do that. There's a number of different features in there that are kind of a part of it. For example, screen resolution. When you fire up a virtual machine, it has this very basic video driver. And you're going to end up with an 800 by 600 resolution. Now, I was perfectly happy with 800 by 600 for years and years and years, so it's not a bad thing necessarily for a server. But if it's a desktop, end users, they all have widescreen monitors now. They all have 16 by 9 or higher resolution. 800 by 600 is pretty small. There's a lot of utilities, the vSphere web client itself, that are a nightmare to use. In 800 by 600, it's too small. So if we install the VMware tools, it allows the virtual machine to see additional video memory. And now it can have a 16 by 9 resolution. Now it can have 1280 by 720 or even 1920 by 1080 if you want. You can do the higher resolutions that we're used to these days. You can even do multiple monitors. Why would a virtual machine ever have multiple monitors? Short answer is it wouldn't, right? But if you're doing VDI, virtual desktop, now an end user might be on a thin client with 2 monitors and they want their virtual machine to have 2 monitors, and so they need that. So you can actually have that functionality if the VMware tools are installed. Sound support. If you want your sound to work at all, you've got to have VMware tools installed. It's got the drivers for the VMware sound sublayer. If you're just doing servers, you don't care about that. I usually don't. But if you're doing VDI, you do. quiesced snapshot support. When you take a snapshot is freezing your hard drives at a point in time, at a particular point in time. And so when you roll back to that point in time, you roll back to that snapshot, it's like a time machine. You go back in time. Well, what happens if your virtual machine is running when you take the snapshot? I just did that a minute ago. I took a snapshot of a running virtual machine. And while it was running, what if it was halfway through writing a file to that hard drive? It was halfway through writing. Was it all the way through? No, it was halfway. Well, if that was an internal file, if I was copying from one place on the hard drive to another, when I roll back to that snapshot, it'll just finish that copy operation, no harm, no foul. But what if I was copying that file from a network resource, and I took a snapshot halfway through copying that file from a network resource, or writing to the database from a network resource? When I roll that machine back to the snapshot later on in the future, it's going to be back at that point in time, and the network resource that it was copying or the application that was calling it may not even be around anymore. It's definitely moved on to other things. And so now that data is corrupt. You only get half the data and it corrupts your database. Or you have damaged files on the hard drive and you don't know it because they were halfway through writing when you took that snapshot. So taking a snapshot of a running machine is not a good idea. If you take a snapshot of a machine that's turned off, the hard drives are completely still, everything is happy, you'll get a great snapshot that works 100% of the time. So you can always take a snapshot while it's powered off. But now you have to have downtime anytime you take a snapshot. Well, if you install the VMware tools, the virtual machine now knows that it's running on a host. And when you go to take a snapshot, the snapshot subsystem will tell the virtual machine, hey, I need you to hold off on any writes that you're doing for a moment. And the virtual machine will start caching writes into RAM. And you can take a snapshot of the hard drive as it is right now without those writes going on. And what it does is it quiesces. It tells it, hey, finish what you're writing right now, but anything new, just hold it in RAM for a minute. And so it quiesces, it quietens down the drives. The drives get quiet, and we take a copy then. And then it does its writes and moves on. With Windows, you have volume shadow copy, and that's what it's kind of using for this, the volume shadow service provider. In Linux, it actually uses its own little providers that are a part of the VM tools. But if you want quiesced snapshots, you got to have that. And you might have noticed that option when I went, here, I'll take DB01. When I went to take that snapshot, there was an option down at the bottom, quiesce guest file system, okay? And see the note beside it? Needs VMware tools installed. And so when I took that snapshot of Web01, Web01 was up and running. And so I took a snapshot, and down here I chose to do a snapshot of the virtual machine's memory, but I couldn't quiesce the file system. So I potentially could have corrupt data in that snapshot I just made. If I had VMware tools installed, though, I could check this, and I would know the data would be safe, right? Another feature is time synchronization. Every virtual machine is going to have a clock. Every operating system has a clock. And normally they rely on their hardware clock to be able to see that, but in a virtual machine you don't have a hardware clock. You have the host. And so with VMware tools, it can synchronize the clock between the host and the guest. So it's a great way to have those times synchronized so we don't have to worry about having individual BIOS clocks on every VM. They can all pull from that one main location, and that's done through VMware tools also.
Now, Don, when you install those VMware tools there, is there any post-installation configuration you have to do, or is it just push and click and we're ready to go?
It can actually be really simple, right? On a Windows machine, for example, you launch the VMware Tools installer and you click next 3 times and it's done. I mean, there's no options to configure. You just literally hit next, 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 done, right? I guess you have to give it the administrator credentials, right? You have to accept the, what is it, UAC prompt or whatever it is that Windows has. In the Linux or Unix world, it's a little more complex because we got to drop to the command line, get it installed. It's a little bit harder. Although I will say there's a lot of Linux distributions now that are baking the VMware tools into the distros already. So if you install Ubuntu, for example, or the newer Red Hat releases, they've already got VMware tools built into them. So you don't even have to install the VMware tools. You just load the virtual machine up and it's already there. It's already part of the OS. So it's kind of neat to have that. For most of us, that's it. You're just going to install it and that's it. But you can customize them. You can go in and tweak some of the settings. For example, time synchronization. I know I just mentioned it and said it's great. There is actually a time where it's not so great, and that is if you have a virtual machine that is a Microsoft Windows Active Directory domain controller. Boy, domain controllers hate having their clock synced by anything other than NTP. If you're syncing it with a host BIOS, It's a nightmare. It will break your domain controller. It's bad news. So on a Windows domain controller, if you're running that as a VM, you'll want to turn off time synchronization. And so you do have those options. We can edit them in the virtual machine settings. I don't actually have, I don't have my tools installed yet. But I'll show you where they are. We do need to install them. I know I just don't have enough time for it. But if I take Web01 here, I'm going to go into Web01 and go to Manage and Settings. And under Settings, you've got VM Options. And so if I go to VM Options, under the options over here, you'll see VMware Tools Settings. And you can expand that out. And there's settings in here. Let me just go to the edit screen on this. I'm going to go to the edit screen so we can actually see the individual choosable options. And what you'll see is you can tweak a lot of this stuff. The power operations, okay? Normally, if I tell VMware to shut down a virtual machine, it's like yanking the power plug out of it. Is that a good thing? If I have a server up and running, I just yank the power plug out of it, well, I might have writes that were halfway through and I just lost data. I might have corrupted data. It's not a good idea. If I have the virtual machine tools installed, though, I can tell it, hey, when I tell it to shut down, gracefully shut down the guest. If it's a Linux box, send it the shutdown command. If it's a Windows box, send it the shutdown command, and they'll gracefully shut down. That's what we want. That's part of what VMware Tools can do. So you can come in here and set how that works. You can set scripts that run after powering on, after resuming, and so on. We can define whether or not we want those. A lot of my options are grayed out here because I haven't installed the VMware Tools yet. I can do tools upgrades. If there's an upgrade for VMware Tools, do we automatically push it to the virtual machines? They check every time they power on. And time. Do I want to synchronize the guest time with the host? And I can turn that on and off. So if this is a domain controller, I want to come in and turn that off, uncheck it. But if it's a web server, database server, whatever, then it's perfectly fine to synchronize that. I can leave that turned on. But these are kind of the limits of the configuration right here.
Don, speaking about VMware tool scripts there in the Linux world, do you have like a sudo script you can run and it configures it for you, or is this a very manual process?
No, there's actually a series of scripts that are available really for every operating system. Some of them are nice and easy, like the Windows one where you have a GUI. It's a graphical user install that you just click on next a few times and you're done. In the Linux world, we do have to go to the command line. In the Mac world, you have to go to the command line. It just kind of depends on your OS, on which one you want to do. And I want to show this to you guys, but I know we're out of time. So I mentioned we'd probably have a part 3, so I think we're going to do that. We'll do a part 3. I'll install the VMware tools, and then I still have some other things that we need to get to, some bells and whistles that I want to show off for virtual machine configurations too. So we'll pick that up in part 2.
Well, that sounds part 3. Yes, it's going to be the trilogy here for sure. Well, Don, we do appreciate having you in the studios, and we do appreciate you coming by and giving us all this information. But before we sign out, do you have any additional information for this one?
I got to stop while I'm ahead, Wes. If I keep going, this is going to be the longest episode on record. So just remember, VMware tools are important. You definitely want to install them on your virtual machines if you can.
All right. Well, we appreciate having you in the studios, and we appreciate you, the viewer, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.